This morning we're beginning a new worship series that leads us on a journey of exploration as we look at the question, who are we? We'll discover the link between who are we and whose are we as we go through this series. I look forward to our time together exploring this and looking at the difference it means to be a part of the family of God, what it means to be our very best selves for God. This morning, we're reflecting on Jesus' baptism and the impact his life and ministry had on all of us. Then later in this worship service, you'll have the opportunity, like I told the kids, to take a moment to remember your own baptisms, to remember the voice of God proclaiming to each of us that you are my beloved. And as the beloved children of God, each of us are named and each of us are called to live our lives with abundance, with the abundance of God's grace and love and acceptance. And just as we receive in abundance, we are asked to give in abundance. Please pray with me. Creator God, when everything first began, water became a symbol of refreshing, of washing away, of renewing. Through the waters of creation, you brought forth abundant life. We gather today to remember Jesus' baptism, to remember how your Spirit proclaimed that he was your beloved Son, in whom you were very well pleased. Our spirits resound with that proclamation. Through his baptism, Jesus' ministry was started, dedicating his life without reservation. Help us to dedicate our lives to you too, to offer you our very best selves. We ask all of this in your name. Amen. The prophet Isaiah opens chapter 42 with a prophecy that links very closely to our gospel reading today. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. Here is my servant, he says. In those words, the prophet is sending a clear message, emphasizing the value of servanthood, the impact of servanthood on our faith. In the verses that follow those opening words, the prophet goes on to explain what it means to be a servant, what it means to be a servant of God. While the identity of the servant in this text is never clearly stated, never identified, the attributes are. What is emphasized is the what rather than the who. It seems at this point that God is more interested in what is accomplished rather than who is accomplishing it. God's main concern is that God's justice and God's righteousness is brought to all of the nations. It's important to note that God does not ask for any of this to come about through force, but rather with the servant's voice, never being raised, for them never to be overwhelmed. The image is in this passage of restraint, the bruised reed unbroken, the dimly lit wick unquenched, give new meaning to the word grace. God is calling for justice that's unlike anything we've ever seen before, anything the people had ever seen before at the time. But what is God's justice? When we think of justice, we think about what happens in our courtrooms. Justice is often seen as arbitrating disputes, determining who is innocent and who is guilty, handing out punishments for crimes. But God's justice is not the same. God's justice means that the hungry are fed, that the prisoners are set free, that the blind are able to see, and those who are bowed down are lifted up, and that the immigrants and the widows and the orphans are cared for. God's justice is the light that shines brightly into the dark places. It's what makes possible all people to live abundantly. God's justice is life-giving and light shining. While our earthly version of justice does quite the opposite. God's justice calls for compassion rather than violence, for mercy rather than hostility, and is rooted deeply in peace-seeking and peacemaking. And in order to achieve God's justice in our world, the type of justice that helps all people be their very best selves, we have to do what God has called us to do. We have to follow God's ways instead of our own. And that brings us to the story of Jesus' baptism, as we heard in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus approached John to be baptized, and initially John objected, stating, "No, no, no, no. I need to be baptized by you." And Jesus' response might seem strange at first glance, but knowing the full story, it makes more sense. Jesus' response of "Let it be so, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." He reminds us of why he came into this world in the very beginning. Jesus came into this world to bring God's justice and righteousness to all people. Therefore, through his own baptism, Jesus made a public declaration that he was going to take the side of God's justice, a public declaration that he was going to set about promoting God's work of righting the wrongs, lifting the burdens from the oppressed, made a public declaration that he was going to shine the light of God's truth in all of the dark places all over the world. As we reflect on the why of Jesus' baptism, I'm reminded of that same question for myself and for my kids. Why baptism? What's the point? What's the purpose? While I don't remember firsthand my own baptism, I do have pictures and I've heard stories that have been passed down to me from my parents. I do have a lot of firsthand experience of the lifetime of faithful support by my parents and a great cloud of witnesses that surrounded me as a baby, as a young child, as a teenager, and now as an adult. Then, for our children, it was important for us to make an outward commitment that we would raise them in the church, encourage them in their faith development until they could make that commitment on their own. It was also important for us to connect them with faithful communities that would help them and help us along the way. As parents, we saw the value in making that commitment on the day of their baptisms and have continued to see the value every day of their lives. Baptism is a blessing. It's a gift from God, and Jesus knew that too. And that might be one of the reasons behind Jesus' persistence to getting baptized by John. Since Jesus was not in need of forgiveness, we can be certain that baptism is not simply a means for forgiveness. For Jesus, his baptism announced God's favor and established who Jesus was. In our gospel reading today, the voice from heaven announces that Jesus is God's beloved Son, the one with whom God is very pleased. Baptism for Jesus was less about forgiveness and more about a commissioning. His baptism served as a launching point for his mission and his ministry and an assurance of God's presence with him all of his days. I said it before and I'll say it again and again and again. Baptism is a blessing and it is a gift from God. As many of us are well aware, blessings often also come with responsibility. Jesus lived his life obedient to God. He received his blessing and he lived his life fully devoted to God. And that's what we're called to do too. We're called to be like Jesus and strive to never let anything lead us astray. It will. And that's what grace is all about. but we're always striving to be more like Jesus. Many of the disciples tried to sway him, convince him it was too hard. You could do this instead. People tried to get him to become the king that would overtake the world. But he declined that because he knew that wasn't the plan. He knew that wasn't God's plan. So he kept doing what God had called him to do. He stayed the course that God had set him on. This is a reminder that following Jesus is not always easy, but it is always rewarding. Sometimes we will feel unworthy of the blessing, and other times we will feel so overwhelmed we can't even see the blessing anywhere near us. But even in those times, we need to remember that we are loved and that we are blessed. There's nothing more or less that we can do that will make us more or less worthy of God's love, because God is forever faithful to us, cares for us, and blesses us in all our mess, in all our goodness, just as we are. In just a little while, when you come forward for communion, you're invited also to take a moment to remember and reflect on your own baptism. There are a couple bowls here with water and some stones. I invite you to put your hands in there. Let the water rush through them. Feel free to choose a stone that you'd like to take to remember as well. If you haven't been baptized, you're still invited to come forward to remember and reflect Jesus' baptism. Remember the difference that Jesus has in your life. And if you're interested and you haven't been baptized, let me know and we'll work that out. And before I close, I want to share a small little clip of a young man who was so excited to be baptized. May we each face our faith with the same enthusiasm that this young man had in that moment and jump right in to the love and the grace offered to all of us and seek to share that with others. Amen.